In this video, we hear from Lauren. She is a speech-language pathologist, specifically in a school-based setting with students with special needs. She shares the education requirements necessary to become an SLP, as well as what her day-to-day is like. Let's get started. Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much for joining me. I am so excited to hear about your career as a speech-language pathologist.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So can you tell me a little bit about the career, just a brief overview to get started?
So speech language pathologist, or an SLP, as people often refer to as, is essentially, sounds kind of morbid, but a cradle to grave profession. So you can work with babies who are brand new to the world, all the way through adults who are in their final stages and everything in between. Working on articulation or language skills or swallowing skills. There is so much. I personally work with kiddos though.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Awesome. And did you know you always wanted to be an SLP?
No, for the longest time, I was convinced I wanted to be a teacher, elementary school teacher. I always wanted that. But I have two aunts who are speech language pathologists, and I would go to work with one of them every once in a while. And I really started to fall in love with the idea of being able to work one-on-one with kids rather than in that super big group. And one thing kind of just led to another. It wasn't until after I applied to college that I saw that the school that I was going to had the major. I'm like, oh, guess it's gonna work.
That's awesome. So can you tell me a little bit about your education? Because I know you have a master's too.
Yes, so I have my bachelor's degree in speech language pathology and audiology from Loyola University, Maryland. And I have my master's in speech language pathology from Towson University. Because in order to be a practicing SLP, you have to have a master's degree.
Okay, awesome. And what does that next stage of education for you, the master's level, entail? Do you have to do like clinical hours? Is it shadowing? Like, how does that work?
So lots of clinical hours. So you start off the way that my program was run at Towson was that we had an on-campus clinic where you had, for your first year, you worked with clients, kids or adults, all at Towson. And then your second year is when you do like externships, they call them, or internships. And I was out at two different schools. So you have to get a certain amount of hours and experience doing different things in the field before you can graduate and go into the field for real.
Awesome. And in addition to that master's degree, do you need any licensure or certifications?
Yes. So there's a couple of weird steps. So your first year in the field, you're considered a clinical fellow. So you have to complete your clinical fellowship, and you're not a full-blown SLP until you finish that. So after you finish that year, and you're really just highly supervised, you're still doing everything an SLP does, but you have a lot of extra support. Once you finish that, you get your state licensure, or you apply for a state licensure. And then there's also a certificate that's national. So technically the certificate you don't need to practice, but it's kind of common practice that most people apply for it. So I have a state licensure and then a clinical certificate of competence, which is for like the national level.
Awesome. And then once you have all those things, you're full-blown practicing, do you have to do any kind of continuing education credits? Yeah.
Yes, lots of them. So it's like different cycles for your licensure versus your C's, as they call them, your certificate. But each year it's about 10 to 15 on average hours of CEUs, or continuing education units. Mm-hmm. There aren't any harsh requirements for continued formal schooling. Like you don't need to get another master's or anything like that, but continuing education is a heavy part of the job some days, it feels like.
Okay. I think I would love to know what the average age in your like experience that people come out of school and are fully practicing, because I know that sometimes career changers might be afraid to enter a field if they feel like they're coming into it in their 30s or their 40s or what have you. So just in your experience, what is like the demographic of your colleagues, I would say?
So when I was in grad school, most of the people had come straight from undergrad, but
Okay.
that's largely because you can't practice, you can't do that much with the undergrad degree in it. But we did have some people who were coming back after being teachers or in all different fields. There are specific programs. Loyola, where I went for my undergrad, has something called a Post-Bac program, like a Post-Bac laureate.
That sounds right.
So it's like career changers. So there are options. There are people who come into the field at all ages. So kind of anyone. It's not a very clear
Okay.
answer, but there's
No, that's good.
programs designed for people who you don't need to have a background in another field. And then there's programs designed for people who are specifically coming from another field.
Awesome. Very cool. Can you walk me through what you do in a typical day? And that might require you explaining the demographic of kiddos that you work with.
Yes. So I work at a school with kids that all of the kids have special needs. So it's not a public school, it's considered a non-public school. And in the world of COVID, I am totally virtual right now. We've slowly started to open up our campus. But so my school serves kids ages 3 through 21 because in the special education world, kids are eligible for school through age 21. So my typical day can look totally different depending on who I have scheduled for that day. Whether it's virtual or in person, sometimes the start of the day is just looking at your schedule and realizing who you are seeing that day. Kind of just making a plan. Throughout the main bulk of the school day, it's going to a bunch of different sessions, seeing kids, whether that's virtual or when we're in person. You kind of jump around to anywhere. It's a profession that you have to be super flexible with, but I love it. And because I work with a wide range of ages, my day to day often seems very different because 1 minute I'm working with a 4-year-old, and after his 30-minute session is finished, I'm on to my 18-year-old, which is a totally different session.
And can you, as someone who is, I never saw a speech pathologist, like I'm not sure that I know anyone who did. Can you walk me through like what kind of exercises or practices that you might do?
Yes. So a lot of times people remember the kid in their class that would be pulled out for speech in elementary school because they couldn't say R or couldn't say TH or something. My kids, it's a lot more of the language side of speech language pathology. So we work a lot more on, an example is like kids answering WH questions and knowing that if I ask a who question, the answer is a person or a character from a book, or just like functional everyday tasks. Something that I love is you could make it really functional. You can work on, okay, I'm going to give you a job task. And can you answer where you have to go to complete your job or what time you have to be at work today? It feels like such a hard yet easy question to answer that you can really work with kids at any part of their day. Like I have a lot of fun when we're in person. I will go and I will join a class while they're at cooking class and we'll work on sequencing the steps to making like English muffin pizza. But then the next minute, maybe I'm just reading a story to them and they're answering questions. It could be something super hands-on or something super just like typical of I sit on one side of the table and you sit on the other.
Yeah, that's so cool. Now, do you have any, I don't want to say like software, but tools that you use for these processes? Like you just explained some very hands-on techniques, but are there, I don't know, any resources for you to like Google to like come up with new ideas, things like that?
Yes. So there are in the more medical side of the world of speech pathology, which I am not in. I went for the education route, working with kids, but in the medical side of things, there's a lot of like equipment and things like that. For me, it's more think of like teachers that the websites like Teachers Pay Teachers, they have great resources.
Yeah.
Have a lot of, it sounds weird, like workbooks that I will take a workbook and then usually you transform it completely and like the activity that the workbook suggested, or you build off of it. Honestly, working with kids, I've only ever worked with kids that have complex needs. All of my students, most of them are pretty involved. So what's really fun is a lot of times I work with what's in the room. Like we go to the therapy room and they walk over and they pick up a car, and then we spend 30 minutes working on their goal all on a car. The part about being super flexible as a school-based SLP is you never know what type of day the kids are having. Maybe you have them just after they had a test or just after they came back from lunch and they have so much energy. Well, then just sitting at the therapy table probably isn't going to be super productive. So maybe you go on a walk for your session that day, or you go and you do something physical and so that they're busy and moving. That was a super long answer. So no, I don't have any equipment that I have to use. I just kind of bounce along, and sometimes I use the spoon, fork, and a knife that we find in the kitchen. It could really be anything.
That's awesome. It sounds like a really adaptive type of situation.
Yes, it keeps me on my toes in a fun way.
So you did mention a therapy room. In the non-COVID world, if a kid has the ability to focus at that given time, what does that atmosphere look like? I don't know, it sounds like toys there or things like that.
Yes. So I have a unique situation that my school has a total of 8 SLPs, which is kind of unheard of. A lot of times there's only 1 or 2 SLPs, but it's just based on the population I work with. There's a lot of kids who require our service. So I do not have my own therapy room. We just have a couple of speech therapy rooms scattered throughout campus. So it kind of makes it more fun because I get to use all the toys and all the equipment. But yes, it's exactly what they are thinking of as like a kid's favorite place to go. There's a cabinet that has lots of goodies and books and puzzles and toys and Play-Doh and kind of anything you could think of. And the trick that we like to use is to have cabinets that the door is totally closed, so the toys aren't seen at all times. Want those things to be hidden, so that you can close the door and focus on what you have. But if you work at a school that you're the only SLP, you probably have your own therapy room, which often is also your office, and you have all of the fun toys you could imagine. And there are certain things like my school, all of our kids love Uno. So there are Uno cards in like every therapy room we have. And you could use Uno to work on so many different goals. So you kind of meet the needs of what your kiddos are into.
That's so cool. So you did mention the office side of things. So beyond the hands-on role of working with your kids, what does the administrative side look like? I would imagine there's some kind of reporting and tracking that you have to do.
Yes. So the paperwork is my least favorite side of being SLP. There's a lot of it. So every time you see a student, you have to write it up. If you didn't write about it, it's like it never happened. And when you work in a school, kids are entitled to those services legally. So if you didn't see them and you don't document it, it's like it never happened and you owe them that time. So every time you see a kid, you have to write it up, and you want to make sure you really capture what the kid did. I don't want to just say like, oh, he got this with like 80% accuracy. I want to write why. Like, did he do really poorly today because he was having a bad day, or did I really challenge him and give him way harder material to work with? We also do assessments for kids. So in the school world, it's typically about every 3 years we do formal assessments, which those reports take a lot longer and keep you busy, but it's cool to see kids' progress and helps you figure out where to go next. The last big part of paperwork is progress reports. Again, working at a school, it's kind of like a report card, and we do those 4 times a year. And it's kind of like the fun time to brag to the parents about like what their kiddos have been doing.
Yeah.
So it's very busy on the paperwork end, but it's the only way to kind of show all the hard work that your students have been doing.
And do you ever have to have phone conversations with parents at all, or meetings in person in non-COVID times about those
Yes.
progress reports?
Yeah, so in the school world, kids have something called an IEP, or an individualized education plan. So kind of like the roadmap for their special education. And you meet for those meetings once a year. And sometimes parents are in person, sometimes they're over the phone, sometimes parents aren't able to join. Um, so leading up to those meetings once a year, and when you're doing assessments, you're often talking to parents. And then sometimes you have parents that you're like, oh, I need to email them like every week. Something's just coming up. Other parents, it's once a quarter you end up touching base with them. The really positive side of COVID is that when working from home, I have gotten to know my family so much better. And although it has been so hard working in the virtual world with kiddos, it has made it so meaningful for them. Like I'm really seeing, okay, how do I make sure that this is something that fits into their everyday life? Is this even something that is going to make a difference for them?
Mm-hmm.
In working in a school rather than like a private practice, everything we do has to be educationally focused. So like, how is this going to help them in their education? But the beauty of being an SLP is a lot of things fit within that. So we get to be super creative. But yes, long story short, lots of communication with parents now that we're in the virtual world.
In terms of your own professional development, do you go through reviews yourself? Do you have someone shadow you, mentor you? How does that work?
Yes. So as a clinical fellow, so your first year in the profession, you have your clinical fellowship supervisor who my supervisor, we met on a weekly basis, and she would go over my paperwork with me and she would come observe me. But outside of that, the supervision, like mentorship role, at my school, we have one supervisor who she like does paperwork reviews and comes and observes a session and things. That's more based on my school structure though, not based on being an SLP. As far as like SLP world, you don't have someone that's coming and like looking over your shoulder all the time. I do because my supervisor is another SLP. But you have to submit your continuing education and things every year when you, every couple of years when your licensure is up, and that's how they ensure that you're staying up to date and doing what you need to do. But because I work at a school, it's like what teachers have also, you're constantly, people are checking in on you, making sure everything's good.
Cool. And I think to kind of wrap things up, do you have any advice for maybe students who are in high school and they're, exploring this as an option for themselves or college about how to get into the field?
Yes. I would say go and shadow people. Although it sounds like it might be harder in the world of COVID, it actually might be easier because you may not even have to leave your living room. But reach out to schools or private practices or just people in your area if you're interested in this. The world of speech pathology, a lot of people have heard the word just because classmate Johnny was pulled out in third grade, but it's like a mystery of what happened behind those doors. But just reaching out and asking people, I love talking with people who are interested in the field. All of my coworkers, we all love what we do. So if you're interested in kids, go for it. Follow the path that leads you to working with kids. If you want to work with adults, there's a whole world of it. It's really cool that you can have, technically my license allows me to work with kids or adults following a stroke who are working on regaining their ability to swallow. Personally, I only want to work with kids. I find that's what's fun, but follow what you're interested in and don't be afraid to ask questions and ask people to shadow. It's the best way to see what the profession is really like.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. I think that a lot of people are going to get a lot of insight specifically into the world of working in the education side of things from this interview. So thank you so much for your time.
No problem.